Joe Aiello. I am the National Field Coordinator for the Rail Passengers Association. Thank you all for joining us. Today we are going to be talking about the campaign for daily service along the Sunset Ltd. We have a couple of great guests and presenters today. So I'm going to give a quick rundown of what you'll be seeing. On the screen there, we'll have an overview of the call structure and agenda, which is right now. We'll have opening remarks by Bruce Ashton, the main presentation by Steve Roberts and George Chilson. We will have a moderated Q&A by our grassroots organizer, Maddie Butler, featuring Steve, George, Bruce, and Todd Liebman from All Aboard Arizona. Jim Matthews, our CEO and president, will then join us for a call to action and describe what the IMPLAN study, IMPLAN process is. You'll hear a lot of that throughout the afternoon. And then at the very end, we'll tease what we're doing next month. So with that, I introduce from the Rail Passengers Association down in Texas and Texas Rail Advocates, Mr. Bruce Ashton.
Thank you, Joe. I hope everyone enjoys today's webinar. It's packed full of a lot of interesting stuff. My part here is simply to introduce you to how we got it kicked off here in Texas, and it led over to other states. In Texas, of course, you recognize that the Sunset Ltd runs 900 miles from Beaumont to El Paso. We have 7 cities. Each city has a different personality, you might say. Houston goes 4.7 million people in the Harris County to Sanderson, which has less than 1,000 people. We ran across the problem here in Texas, which is always the case between the public and some elected officials, which can be characterized by the phrase, "What? We have Amtrak here in town." It's just an unknown factor. So to get this thing started, we looked at the project. We recognized that we would be making cold calls to everybody. So we had to figure out a way to get introduced. For a background, educational purpose for my half and for everybody else, I went back and studied the PREA 2010 study, which had a study for our daily sunset. I also looked at what the campaigns did for the Cardinal and for the Gulf Coast train. That gave me a background on how to work it. Basically, it boiled down to this. You have to write an introduction letter to the mayor, Chamber of Commerce, county judge. They need to have a quick letter. It needs to be bringing out the highlights of what a daily sunset brings to them. In addition, you need to have the backup information as attachments, which gives you a history of what RPA is. They simply do not know who we are. You also give them stats on ridership, frequency, and other miscellaneous things that come to being from a given talk. Once you have the letter, which is not an easy thing to do, because when you think about doing a letter, there's so many facets that pop into your mind. But that's the cruel, hard part to get started. Second thing you need to do, of course, that we did, of course, is you need to let every member in your state, in our case, Texas, know what you're about to do. Then you ask for volunteers for their help, recognizing that very few are going to come forward, but those that do are your soldiers in the field. They can help you with moral support, they can help you with making arrangements for appointments, and they can help you showing up to support you. I have special thanks to Father Sinclair in Beaumont, Tom Compson there in Houston, Jim Wyatt here in San Antonio, Gwen Jameson in Alpine, Connie Crawford, Becky Snyder, Simon Burton in El Paso, and of course, Ken Correll's out in Tucson. Our trip took us 14 months to visit all 7 cities. Results were outstanding. Surprised me. We've got 14 supporting resolutions and letters, including 4 from Arizona. So we're very grateful for what Arizona did for us in bringing both Tucson and Yuma into the fold. Our plan after we got the supporting documents was kind of simple, sophomoric in some respect. and then we will take the packages of all the resolutions and present it to various congressmen and state, U.S. senators at our spring day on the Hill, which of course got shot down. So now we're at the point of we have to recognize resolutions and letters of support are meaningless unless you can have a follow-up plan that includes some action. We're looking at this from a point of view that we need an economic study to take back to the various cities to show them what a daily sunset means to their economy. And we'll have some people talk later on about this economic study and why we need to have it financed. And that's just a real quick summary of how this all got started. Back to you, Joe.
Thank you very much, Bruce. And as you know, and Bruce will be back in a little while during our Q&A session. So I'd like to introduce both George Chilson, Chairman Emeritus for the Rail Passengers Association, and Steve Roberts, President of the Rail Passengers Association of California and Nevada, also known as RailPac. They will both be giving the main presentation today. So both gentlemen.
Thank you, Joe. Am I on? Can you hear me?
You are on.
Okay. Welcome, everybody, and thanks for joining us to understand more about our campaign for a daily Sunset Limited. It's a template we think that is applicable to probably all of the long-distance routes around the country, and perhaps even the short-distance routes, because a grassroots uprising can be very motivating to higher levels of government, especially when we are able to get elected officials at the local level, like mayors and county commissioners, on our side and supporting the cause. If you doubt that, you just have to look at Mineola, Texas, population 4,500, where the mayor, Celia Boswell, back in the late 90s, defeated Amtrak's attempt to discontinue the Texas Eagle, and by soliciting the support of even the governor, George W. Bush at the time, and Kay Bailey Hutchison, a very powerful United States Senator. Next slide, please. We're going to throw a lot of information at you today, and I hope it's useful for you to organize it in your mind as focusing on three areas. One, the opportunity that this market and its size and growth offers. Number two, the challenges we face, which are multiple, but they all boil down to the capacity and capability of the rail infrastructure. Three is the plan we have for a grassroots campaign, bottoms-up effort to motivate government officials at higher and higher levels. Because quite frankly, if we don't get the Sunset to a daily operation, there is a real probability that it will be discontinued, particularly given the attitude of Amtrak's current top management toward long distance trains in general. Next slide, please. We're going to benchmark the Sunset Corridor with the Northeast Corridor just for the sake of convenience and comparison, because the Northeast is the focus of a lot of Amtrak's attention and resources. Back in 1970, a year before the Amtrak took over the operation of passenger train services, the population of each corridor was about the same. By 2010, 40 years later, you can see in the next bar chart, it was the Sunset Corridor was 80% bigger because it had grown nearly twice as fast or twice as much as the Northeast, which was 600,000 versus almost 12 million in the Sunset Corridor. Next slide, please. We also found that travel patterns between people living in the Southwest and people living in the Northeast were different. Now, this is not people who travel by train. This is people who travel by all modes: highway, bus, air, rail, motorcycle, bicycle, crawling perhaps, but it's based on the Bureau of Transportation Statistics American Travel Survey. Found that the states in the Southwest the people took 20% more trips per capita. And when they traveled, it was 20% further, which meant that when you have a larger population that travels more per person, it was 34% more total intercity trips. And because the trips were longer, they traveled 61% more passenger miles. So there is a lot of mobility need in the Southwest area. Next slide, please. Geography in some cases is destiny, and this is a three-dimensional graph or a map of the United States. And as you can see in the top right, there is a large, heavy red group of urban clusters packed very closely together with a great big towering thing that represents New York City. The north end is Boston, the south end is the Washington, D.C. metro area. You can see when you get out of that northeast corridor area that the population clusters are smaller and they are further apart, which is one reason why it makes sense to run trains longer distances between endpoints. But if you look at the center of the map, from the tip of Texas up north to Minneapolis and Duluth, what is, I think you could call the I-35 corridor. When you get west of the I-35 corridor, the population density drops like a stone. And that's the Great West, where you have small urban clusters and they're spaced further apart. So one of the reasons people in the West travel further is because things are further apart. Next slide, please. Now, this chart illustrates why it makes economic sense to run trains long distances between endpoints. This is the load levels for the Sunset Limited in 2019. The top of the graph represents the average number of passengers on board during fiscal year 2019, the Sunset Limited. And on the left is New Orleans endpoint, on the right is the Los Angeles endpoint. The first layer of this cake, the black one, are people who are traveling the full route between Los Angeles and New Orleans. The dark gray bar are people who are traveling between New Orleans and intermediate parts. So you see there is a substantial number of people who get on in New Orleans who are going all the way to the West Coast and vice versa. But in New Orleans, there are also a ton of people who get on who are going to intermediate points. After the train leaves New Orleans, or before it gets to New Orleans, the light gray part of the chart indicates the number of people who are getting on the Sunset and going all the way to the Los Angeles endpoint. And the dark blue at the top indicates people who are getting on at intermediate points and traveling to intermediate points. And if you took out any one of these layers, the cake would be an awful lot smaller. And that shows why running a train a long distance between endpoints and accumulating a large number of passengers by serving a large number of small volume city pairs is a way to accumulate economic volume levels. Also notice that Los Angeles, with 13 million people, generates far more traffic than New Orleans at a little over 1 million people. And what that says is that having large metropolitan urban clusters at each endpoint of a route makes the entire route a lot more sustainable than if you have a route from a large city to a small minor MSA. Next chart, please. The strong ridership and revenue potential is seen in the fact that there are major cities every 300 to 500 miles along the Sunset route. This is something that could be very good for day travel because driving becomes far less attractive the longer the distance the trip is. And in the West, there are lots of long distance trips, and 300 to 500 miles is much longer than where the automobile is supposed to be most competitive, which is in short distance trips like 25 to 50 miles. Also, there are major tourist destinations that would support a strong sleeper business. There is the Valley of the Sun, Phoenix metropolitan area, Tucson, which are destinations for snowbirds in the winter. El Paso, which is a border town and serves Fort Bliss, a major military base. San Antonio, Austin, and the Gulf Coast around Houston, which are major tourist destinations in their own right, as well as Alpine with Big Bend National Park. Plus the anchor endpoints, Los Angeles and New Orleans, are attractions on their own, and they're also a location of major cruise ports. Also, the Sunset offers connections to other routes in Los Angeles, San Antonio, and New Orleans, which means that daily service will expand the number of city pairs markets served with daily service. It will expand the geographic reach of the Sunset. And as the Eagle Through cars demonstrate, the Midwest market to the Southwest market is an area that is ripe with potential for harvesting. Next slide, please. There have been previous attempts, and as Bruce mentioned, there was the Amtrak Performance Improvement Program that called for daily service, improving the schedule to make the arrival and departure times at major urban areas more attractive to travelers, and a reroute of the road of the Sunset between Riverside and Los Angeles from the Union Pacific line through Ontario and Pomona to the BNSF line through Fullerton and Riverside. BNSF deferred until they could complete the triple track down to Fullerton. The Amtrak board approved the plan, but then UP gave them sticker shock when it requested about $750 million for infrastructure improvement. In spite of the fact, though, that only one element of the plan was implemented, and that was the schedule change, the Sunset achieved the ridership and ticket revenue goals that had been set for it with all three changes, which begins to illustrate the strong and unmet demand for transportation on the Sunset Corridor. In 2019, we updated the performance improvement plan that Amtrak had prepared, and we argued that a 133% increase in frequency had a reasonable probability of producing a 125% increase in ridership and revenue, and if that happened, it would bring the system to a break even, meaning that the increased revenue that Daily Sunset would produce not only for itself, but its connections like the Eagle, the Crescent, the City of New Orleans, the Coast Starlight, the Pacific Surfliners, and the San Joaquins, the total revenue to the system would pretty much equal the increase in system costs and produce a likely break even or just a small $2 to $3 million increase in federal taxpayer support. And best of all, because tri-weekly service was so inefficient that it wouldn't require any additional equipment, a small change in the mix, but no additional equipment to operate the train daily. But in 2020, we are still at tri-weekly service because RPA presented our updated plan to Amtrak, and Amtrak was not interested because they felt that the Union Pacific requirement of now it was upwards of $1 billion for infrastructure was an unreachable goal. Thank you for changing the slide. And there are many, many challenges, but what it all comes down to, the biggest challenge is the capacity and capability of the rail infrastructure and how to fund it. UP wants now north of $1 billion. We don't know why. We don't know what the improvements they want to fund are, but Steve Roberts has done extensive work in analyzing UP's system, and he is going to pick it up to you right now. And so over to you, Steve.
Thank you. Next slide. The Sunset route links the port parts of Long Beach and Los Angeles, San Joaquin Valley, with the Midwest, South, and Southeast. Freight traffic is heavy and growing. The UP has been making some capacity investments along the route, but there still are congestion points. And the problem is these bottlenecks negatively impact the performance of freight trains, impacting the ability to operate current and proposed service at acceptable levels. The Sunset Limited just can't be operated daily without addressing these capacity issues. The other thing that's occurred is when the other thing that happened is that when the PREA on-time performance requirements were in place, UP changed its policy and basically said they're not signing up for any new rail service where they have to pay penalties on it. So they requiring investments to ensure 95% reliability, not only for the new service, but for the existing service. And of course, now there is the Wall Street financial pressure on the freight railroads to maximize cash flow and minimize capital outlays. And one way you do that is have all your services run at a uniform speed. And also financially, UP has absolutely no incentive to improve the daily Sunset Limited. What's in it for them? And when you look at capacity projects, there's a very high internal ROI needed for infrastructure investments. And there are bottlenecks out there where basically the current operating cost of the UP doesn't meet their minimum ROI. They're fine with a freight train of empties sitting on the main for 3 hours. The problem is the Sunset's behind it. The other issue out there is under the current policy, the freight railroad only gets one bite at the apple for any new Amtrak service. So it needs not only the capacity to run the train tomorrow, but it's got to do an estimate, which is especially critical on a high volume core freight route, what future capacity requirements they may need. And the other flip side of this is that the funding UP capacity for basically network bottlenecks out of the Amtrak capital budget, $1 billion for 8 additional trips a week, just doesn't pass any cost benefit analysis. So that's the conundrum we're in. As UP has high capital needs to guarantee its future, and you got to believe that they pay attention to what happened in Glenview and all the song and dance about getting additional property in Texas and California. And they've had their own issues with neighbors. So they're well aware about the opportunity costs of giving away capacity to passenger trains. Next slide. Their other challenges are political. We still have the policy mandate from Congress that Amtrak minimize subsidies and not maximize public benefits. There are many legislatures who find Amtrak an easy target to polish their conservative credentials. It's a lot easier to call for Amtrak to be privatized than to convert the interstate highways into toll roads, even though they want to do that. The opinion leaders do not understand how long distance routes function or the public benefits generated. The general public, I've found in Amtrak focus groups that I was associated with, is that non-users don't understand that they need the long distance trains until they need them. It's not until their son or daughter moves to a town, starts going to college to a town that's 1,000 miles away without air service that they discover that there's value to long distance trains. It's not until they have a medical condition that says they can't go up in an airplane that they discover the value of the passenger trains. So it's a major perception out there. And of course, Amtrak tried to play this lack of understanding with their corridors initiatives, because the public understands corridors. They understand commuter trains and short distance trains because they envision themselves using those because they drive congested highways. They just don't envision themselves on a long distance train unless they've taken them. The sunset low frequency makes Amtrak irrelevant to the public in the service area, especially on the Southwest corridor, which is core service area for Southwest, which unlike the other airlines still does a lot of point-to-point and aggressive pricing. Then you have the challenge of coordinating a multi-state, multi-jurisdictional long-distance train route. Really a challenge. And then, of course, internally, it competes with other Amtrak equipment and service initiatives. There's only so much existing equipment to go around, and if you use it for something else, you can't use it for the Sunset. And then, of course, we've seen the Amtrak management strategy over the last couple of years, which is to convert the long distance routes into short distance corridor routes. Next slide. So the plan, so we were stymied, so basically not seeing any breakthrough in either having UP reduce their capacity requirements or being able to shove billions of dollars through the Amtrak capital budget for essentially freight railroad investment. We took a look at the examples out there that were successful. There was a Southwest Chief, there was a Gulf Coast Service, there was a Texas Eagle, which George already mentioned. These were all bottoms-up grassroots efforts. So that's what we look to do. We marshal support from elected officials and business groups at the city and county level, and especially small town mayors that have proven very influential allies in this effort. They can often punch above their weight and create an organic consensus, local, state, and congressional level for additional Amtrak service. And from that, you can, just as the folks in Colorado and Kansas did, it becomes a catalyst to go and find Bill and Chrissy grants to address these I was doing my Marco Rubio moment there, to do Bill and Chrissy grants to eliminate bottlenecks. And that way you get the capital investment outside of the Amtrak budget. You also, by delivering system benefits, Sunset Campaign can be a value partner with the UP. And that's something that the Capital Corridor and the San Joaquin Regional Rail Commission have done with great success. They're spending a great deal of money right now in the northern San Joaquin Valley building rail infrastructure, and with UP's complete cooperation, because they come, unlike Amtrak, which walks in the room and say, we have the statutory right to run this train. Let us know when you can run it. And oh, by the way, we have no money. We go to the UP and you work as a partnership. And that's what this is foundation of this grassroots effort is to do, is to build broad local support, willingness and a willingness for the locals to do a local match, which improves the local ranking and a level of broad support, especially if that local match is a whole bunch of small towns across the state with all the Congress representatives to come along with it. And then you go to the UP and you tell them, we're a serious partner with you. And you drive the process independent of Amtrak, just as was done in the Southwest Chief example. Next step. Next slide, please. So the initial outreach to stakeholders, as Bruce indicated, is completed. They've done an admirable job of going out and doing the initial introduction and outline of the issue. The demand and feasibility study is done. That was the Amtrak process improvement plan. There's no reason to doubt that it's not still valid. The economic benefit study is in process. We just need to run the IMPLAN part of this in order to finish it. Once that is done, then the advocates can go out and re-engage the stakeholders, use the hard numbers from the benefit study to show the value to each community of the daily sunset. In other words, you you can tell these communities what's in it for them with these benefit studies. And then as you do that, you start to solicit commitments for some local matching funds to apply for a Build or Chrissy grant for the Sunset route. And it doesn't have to be one large grant from one city. We collect them from the large number of cities, try to get the states to involve, and just build up a small amount. I think it's the broad base of the match that is really attractive on the political side, because it shows the heart. In other words, just based on what I saw from the Southwest Chief ones, it seems that the DOT grant weighers give a little bit extra credit when you've got a large number of participants in it. So we do that. And then with that, we do with that grant would be for a capacity study to identify projects and costs. And certainly with the new precision scheduled railroad, there's a need for a new capacity study outside of what UP did earlier, because the things move around now. And this study could be done with an independent consultant with UP Review, or the Union Pacific could do it. Whatever, UP is going to be the final arbitrator. So there's no illusion here that we're somehow going to go around the UP with a capacity analysis. At the end of the day, they're the ones driving it. It's their railroad. So, but we just, perhaps an independent person come up with some different ideas that UP hasn't thought of and things like that. It's still going to be a lot of money, because UP is only doing what's absolutely necessary capacity, because that's the way Wall Street wants the railroads to run at this point. The other thing to look at is is to look at some project. Once we know the projects, to pick some of the projects for an early win. It could be a small, high visibility project, or it could be a high congestion project where the environmental and early design and engineering has already been completed. But we want to strive for an early win. And then longer term, and I know, I think RPA has explored this a little bit, is explore railroad future capital charge for their future needs issue, which would take this whole one bite of the apple issue off the table, and we would only be dealing up front with what we need to run the train tomorrow. And so UP wouldn't have to guess, oh, I need to add 10 more, lengthen 10 more sidings 20 years from now, and I got to get the money up front. No, we figure out a way to pay that now. And finally, the upside potential is the federal government railroads are natural partners in rail infrastructure. Both are responsible for interstate commerce. We have seen railroad cost sharing, or federal, state, and local dollars leverage railroad cost sharing, which reduces their ROI to join a project. Public-private partnerships are something that's compatible with free market capacity. And especially when the project is in that congressman's district, all of a sudden their philosophy on economics changes when federal dollars are coming to their district. And it provides an opportunity to create some innovative ways to fund rail infrastructure improvements. So that's what our goal is. It is a heavy lift. Next slide. But given the two alternatives, which we don't think are going to happen, haven't happened in 10 years, and I don't think will happen, this is maybe a way out. So this is what we're going to give a try to. The alternative is discontinuous. The Sunset and Cardinal have the lowest revenue cost ratio of any Amtrak routes, and they will be there. They have a perpetual target on their backs. So that's it for now.
All right, thank you to George and Steve for that. We are going to move on to our Q&A session. We'd like to bring in both Bruce and Todd. I'm going to introduce Maddie Butler, who is our grassroots organizer here at the Rail Passenger Association, a member of our field team. So Maddie, take it away.
Yeah, so I've been fielding questions from our members. Thank you so much to everyone that has written in. This is going to be questions directed to people from each of the states along the route, as our panel is here. If you have additional questions, feel free to put them in the chat box. Just with regards to time, we're going to go through the listed questions that we have currently. We will address your additional questions in our follow-up content. That will be at railpassengers.com/webinars. We'll be sure to send a link to that in the follow-up email. Joe, could you give us our first question, please? This is for Bruce and Steve. What's the future of train service to rural stations, those small communities far removed from air and train service? Seniors and youth unable to drive long distances via car to reach service stations would be left without an additional travel option. Let's start with Bruce.
It's the root of what we're looking at. Here in Texas, we have the small towns of course, Alpine and Sanderson. You have got medium-sized towns, which like Beaumont and Del Rio, they lack any air service, or they lack consistent air service. So the loss of the Sunset Limited is critical for these two. Alpine has bus service, but it goes north-south before it goes east-west. Sanderson has none. Alpine has a fairly good-sized college with a pretty good portion of foreign students. So it's something that needs to be looked at. In addition, we've got the little community of Mineola sitting out there that could also use service. So that's three key points that we see. So it's seniors, of course. More and more seniors don't want to drive. More and more seniors don't like the chaos of going to security at the airport and being cramped in. They're not completely aware of the benefit of the wide spacing that's offered to them on Amtrak thing. So I hope that answers part of the question.
I just wanted to comment that even cities with air and Greyhound service, as a result in their shift to market-based networks, some of this services for some travel is not what it used to be. Greyhound has shifted to a quarters hub city format, and what this means is there's limited service outside high volume city pairs, and rural bus routes. Riders face circuitous routes via hub city and multiple coach changes, and they have to transfer their own bags at these transfers. Greyhound doesn't do that anymore to get to where they're going. You can't ride a bus between Denver and Omaha anymore. You have to go to Kansas City, change, and then ride from Omaha to Kansas City. On the air side, the focus is on maximizing total revenue. They may have great air service to a medium-sized city, and if you want to go to Hong Kong or London, your fare is quite competitive. But if you want to fly to the hub city that's 300 miles away, Fargo to Minneapolis, it's $250, $300. Just about any shorter distance flight on a regional air carrier is in the neighborhood of $200 to $300. If you're not going to a hub city, but going to another major city, you're forced to go through the hub. If you want to go from Tucson to El Paso, you got to fly to Phoenix or fly to Las Vegas, change, and then fly to El Paso. The resulting trip time is close to 6-7 hours, which is about the same time as driving between Tucson and El Paso or taking the train between Tucson and El Paso. So even though these cities have air and bus service, in many cases, it's not really usable by leisure travelers, which is maybe why that you see such a peak in rail travel, coach route travel in a 300 to 700 mile segment, because that is kind of become the sweet spot where trains are very competitive with this high cost local air service. And so now just a footnote to that is Sunset is paralleled with Southwest Airlines, which is a little bit more aggressive pricing and has a few more direct city service than the other mainstream airlines do. That's it.
Cool. I think that's super informative. Thanks, guys. Joe, can we have the next slide? This one is for Bruce. What is in store for upgrading station facilities? Houston, Texas is where our commenter is from, to facilitate ingress and egress.
In your Facebook comment, it's a long uphill battle. Most the general population and a whole lot of city leaders keep thinking that the Amtrak stations are owned by Amtrak, whereas in reality, they're either owned by their own city or UP. Of course, in Houston, there is a contingency working on to get the stations relocated as a result of the expansion of the Interstate 45, which will actually, they need the land that the current station is on. Unfortunately, that station's owned by UP. So if there's any money paid to UP to replace that station, it's not going to go to a new station that the city will have to build. There's initial talks, but it's basically at ground zero, and not much has happened yet. So we've got a few people there in Houston, RPA members, who are actively engaged in it. They've raised the whistle. They've got a few leads, but basically the people of Houston are going to have to demand a new station.
That makes sense. Let's get the next question. Okay, this one's for Todd. And Todd, thank you again for joining us for the panel today. It's great to have somebody from Arizona. So this is partly anecdotal, so I'm going to read this to our audience. I take the Sunset Limited from Tucson, from LA, and I have run into numerous problems due to the current 3 times weekly schedule. I've had trains canceled with short notice or schedules changed to make it impossible to retain connections to where I live in the San Francisco area. I've had to stay extra days in Tucson due to the lack of a daily train. In most cases, I could have made do with the train the next day, but as you know, the current situation means there is a 2 to 3 day offset in getting another train. I've been hurt financially when reservations for hotels were non-refundable, and I've had to scramble to find other accommodations on short notice when cancellations occurred. What has this experience been like for others? Can you help us get a real resolution for what to do when we get stuck? What is the best course of action if we do get stuck? I wholeheartedly support your efforts to get this train onto a daily schedule and make planning and modifying my trips so much easier.
Well, great. Thank you, Maddie. You know, I feel the questioner's pain, because this is, and Arizona is a perfect laboratory for the problems of tri-weekly service. And we can see that in the contrast that we have between the daily Southwest Chief and the tri-weekly Sunset. You see the economic impact on communities and the rallying of support in the Southwest Chief communities when the Southwest Chief is threatened. And on the other hand, we have challenges down here because, as you know, some of the other folks have indicated, you know, sometimes, like I went to Sierra Vista City Council the other night, and they don't even know that if they knew the train stopped in Benson, they had forgotten it. But they were thrilled to know that it's there, and they're thrilled to know about our campaign to get daily service. So one of the points that I made previously to Maddie was that, you know, I go to visit my son in Texas, where he's stationed at Fort Hood. The Sunset Limited is a perfect way to get there, but unfortunately, sometimes I just can't do it. You know, when you work full time, it's very hard. I believe that daily service is essential, and to making it relevant to the communities. And it's part of the economic development piece, and it's part of, it really is, it's part of making the Sunset more and more relevant. Now, how we do that, I think we do that through the method that's been outlined, which is starting with grassroots support, and then getting some of these studies going off the ground to talk about the economic impact. But, you know, if we want to expand rail in Arizona, and we have a number of efforts to do that. We're looking at the Sun Corridor between Tucson and Phoenix. We have a number of opportunities. The daily Sunset, in my view, is the catalyst to getting that going. And, you know, like I say, I've lived, you know, I grew up in a large city in the Midwest, but I've lived in smaller communities with close by Amtrak service, and use Amtrak a lot when it's convenient and it's possible to do. And in my view, getting daily service is essential. And as far as dealing with some of the issues you identified as to what to do when you're stranded, that just highlights the need for daily service even more. So, the more support we can get for making the Sunset daily is the best way to, solve a lot of the problems, including expanding rail throughout the growing Southwest.
Totally. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you, Todd. This one is for George. Is there passenger equipment, locos and cars, for the Sunset to go daily? Or if not, how long before equipment could be tamed for the Sunset to go daily?
It's a good question, and the answer is going to seem not credible. But the fact of the matter is, according to our analysis of what equipment is currently assigned to the Sunset Limited, that it will not take any more equipment to run the Sunset daily than it currently takes to run it tri-weekly. The issue is that tri-weekly service is so inefficient in its equipment utilization that this is why it is possible. As Amtrak, if it goes through with its plan to reduce all but one of the long distance trains to 3 times a week, we'll probably find out that it's just economically not efficient, that what will happen is Amtrak will be delivering the taxpayers less, but it will be charging them more. They're going to get more for less. They're going to get less service for more cost than they would if they continued to run the trains on a daily basis. The tri-weekly service is just not a sustainable, economically reasonable way to operate a train. The amount of people who abandon a service because as some of the comments we've already had, because it's not convenient or not feasible to fit into their schedules, means that revenue is very likely to plummet far faster than whatever costs they are able to eliminate.
Yeah, I think that goes in par with what we were presenting earlier and definitely highlights our push for daily service. Thank you, George. Next slide, Joe. This is another one for Todd. Why have discussions about passenger rail service in Arizona struggled to gain support? They have voted in Phoenix and Tucson to support more transit many times. So what is the holdup on getting Amtrak to be a part of those discussions?
Well, this is a great question, and I think it's multifaceted. The first point I would make is frequently the legal issues have been cited as one of the challenges. So Arizona does have a constitutional prohibition against utilizing gas tax funds for rail passenger improvements. But that's only part of the picture because most states had various public improvement type of prohibitions that come out of the progressive era in their constitutions. I think probably more than the legal issue is the political will. I think sometimes the legal issues have been used as a sort of a dodge to say, well, there's nothing we can do, and people throw up their hands and say, I guess we just got to live with this. But Arizona does have citizen initiative provisions, and so citizens can get items on the ballot. The second challenge that I'd just like to say is, I think probably there's a lot of diverse groups that are really interested in this, and just getting all of us together, from all aboard Arizona to these other groups. I've had some wonderful discussions with individuals that are interested in revitalizing downtown Phoenix and giving it sort of a destination, the warehouse district where Union Station in Phoenix is located. They view passenger rail as a catalyst to that kind of development and are wholeheartedly supportive of these efforts. Other individuals that are interested in mobility are wholeheartedly supportive. I think the lack of a leadership and structure from the political level is really the challenge. And so, and we've had discussions about this in our board meetings. I think we start with getting a grassroots support, going out and visiting all these communities, which is on our list to do as soon as the pandemic's kind of slowed us down, but we're moving forward on that. And I think going out, getting grassroots support, if you live in this area and you're on the corridor, please join All Aboard Arizona, check out our website, get involved. I'll be glad to come to any city council meeting and talk about this issue. But I think we can get the Sun Corridor going if we get the grassroots support, and we've got the support from RPA to do the studies, and I think that's exciting. So I'm optimistic, but it's going to take a lot of work.
Well, thanks for sharing your optimism, Todd. I know there's a lot of young urbanists in Phoenix that are really looking forward to seeing how all aboard Arizona and RPA's relationship grows through the Sun Belt. So thank you for that. We'll take our next slide, Joe. Okay, this one's for Steve. I would like to hear about progress toward restoring service on the Sunset from Florida. What states are supporting? What states are throwing up roadblocks? Overall, how much advocacy? What is the probability of success? What are the next steps? When is the New Orleans to Orlando section of the Sunset Limited going to be returned? So it's a whole lot of questions. Whatever you feel is the most concise way to present that.
Okay,
Steve,
well, there's a
have at
great
it.
deal of effort with the Southern Rail Commission for service between New Orleans along the Gulf Coast. And of course, they're trying to start out with a local train to Mobile. As part of the Gulf Coast Service Initiative, Amtrak performed various ridership and ticket revenue forecasts for both local service as well as long distance service. So they took a look at both the extended Sunset Limited as well as the extended City of New Orleans, which is actually something that no one ever thought of before as far as extending the city down there. But the fact of the matter is the extended city performs better. It's not that there's no ridership on extended Sunset, it's just the city performed better. And the reason is that the community of interest between the upper Midwest and the Gulf Coast is so much stronger than between cities on the Sunset route and the Gulf Coast in Florida. So I think what you're going to see going down the road, now clearly when we get to the point where we have the capacity and the work on the state of good repair of the rail line to Jacksonville, we'll want to revisit those forecasts. But just from what I know of travel in the United States, I think the city is always going to be come out on top, because like I said, the community of interest between the upper Midwest and the Gulf Coast is very strong, and magnitudes larger than anything looking to the west.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Next slide. Another one for George. How much do the host railroads want when daily service happens? I heard it's billions, ... Is that true? I think you alluded to this in your presentation, Simon, if you'd like to elaborate more on that, George.
Amtrak has told us that it was currently north of $1 billion. We do not know what UP is asking for in terms of what projects they feel are necessary to operate the Sunset, or whether they are planning 20 years down the road, as Steve mentioned, because they currently only get one bite at the apple, so to speak, for infrastructure improvement. That's part of why we want to get money to do a capacity study, hopefully in conjunction with UP. And we're trying to engage Union Pacific, people who have retired from UP who may be free to talk to us about what are the major system constraints. It could be bridges over the Colorado River in Yuma. It could be bridges over the Neches River in Beaumont. It could be sidings here. It's not just UP as well, but it's also BNSF on the very eastern end of it, because Avondale Yard seems to be a major choke point and a major source of delay. So part of it is we've got to know what the capacity constraints are so that we can identify what projects are needed and how much they should cost. Steve, would you like to add anything to that answer?
No, I think you've got it right. I mean, where you find the railroads most willing is perhaps on their secondary routes. Chicago, St. Louis, UP was glad to help. In the case of Northern California here, they were glad to let essentially the San Joaquin Regional Rail Commission take over the former Western Pacific between Stockton and Sacramento and turn it into a passenger railroad. And so it just depends on the railroad. And that's what makes the Sunset Limited so tough, is that is one of their core routes. And if you look at the changes in the global supply chains that is anywhere but China and bringing them closer to home, well, northern Mexico is going to be a place for a big growth in business, which means growth in traffic on the Sunset route. And there was just 3 weeks ago, there was a little bit of a dust up when all of a sudden some ships arrived from China at the same time everybody wanted to refill their warehouses in the Midwest, and the UP in Santa Fe ran out of well cars and locomotives and crews, and were scrambling around in Los Angeles trying to move traffic. So they're looking to the future. They don't see this temporary slowdown, easing of traffic as permanent. And that drop of traffic is really skewed towards coal and oil and things like that, and not necessarily things that are going along the Sunset route.
And one of the issues that Steve identified too is that east of Houston, there's directional running between Houston and Beaumont. One of the routes is the old Southern Pacific, which is rated for passenger train speeds of 79 miles an hour. In the other direction, it's the old MOP route, which is limited to 60 miles an hour, and being able to access it from Houston is more difficult. That may be one of the congestion points that we're facing too, and what the cost is and how much federal money would be required, we just don't know yet.
Okay. That's very thorough. Thanks, guys. This last question, we're going to go just in order of how the presenters are on my screen. This is a question for everyone, and I kind of received a couple different variations of this question too. But the thesis is, what has been your hardest challenge as advocates? Who or what is standing in the way? We'll start with George.
I'm not at the top.
You're at the top on my screen, sorry.
Oh, top of your screen. Okay. Yeah. I think politics is the hardest challenge. Our highway system, our air system are all integral to the federal interstate transportation system. Railroads fall outside of the public policy area. They are owned by large private corporations. They are financed by the private financial markets, and what the railroads are forced to do because of that situation is quite different from what a public enterprise would do, which is focusing public resources to maximize public benefit. That's been one of the difficult challenges that we've had with Amtrak. Congress has put in legislation that says minimize federal subsidies, or even worse, minimize federal operating subsidies. And that's language that we worked hard, and I think it's in the House bill that that's been passed, HR 2, that changes that language to say Amtrak is to maximize the public benefits delivered from its annual federal appropriation. It's not yet been passed because it's hung up in the Senate. So I would say the hardest challenge we face is political, and how we forge a reasonable partnership between a private industry entity like a railroad and the public funding that's needed for a railroad to serve not just a financial purpose, but also to deliver public benefits that rail can serve, but it's just not profitable to a private enterprise.
Thank you, George. We're going to go with Todd next.
Great, thank you. I've got a couple of things that I think are challenges as I see as an advocate. First, of course, is time. Especially those of us who are still working full time. This is a part-time labor of love. So it's hard for people to take the time and go out to city council meetings and get a chance to present the case for passenger rail. So I think that's where a lot of the folks that are retired are really helpful, that have a little bit more time on their hands and can really pitch in that way. That's the first challenge. But another challenge that I see that has been kind of frustrating is sometimes, first of all, I think advocates are not really often aware of the changes in society that we've seen and that really impact this. I think the younger generation is particularly interested in rail as a way to get around, as a way of transport. And I think so often many of us are stuck in the 1970s where you didn't have these issues of climate change. You didn't have the issues of congestion that we have today.
Right.
You didn't have a lot of the issues.
Right.
And those issues are really coming to the forefront. And we have to stop looking at things from a 1970s, 1980s. We can't do this. It's not realistic. It just can't happen. I think those are some of the biggest challenges that advocates have to overcome. We have to understand how people are going to live in the future. They're going to live in smaller homes. Some younger people are going to move to smaller communities too that are more affordable, especially since they can work from home. And we're seeing that particularly along the Southwest Chief route, where people are interested in moving to these smaller communities. And finally, the challenge that I really see for advocates is not to cannibalize each other. Sometimes, there's a lot of tangents that people get on. Well, we ought to get rid of Amtrak. We ought to create a new structure. That's not realistic from a legal perspective, in my view. The other thing is, nobody rides the train to Benson, Arizona. We should just go to a bunch of stub trains. Well, Benson, Arizona serves an area in excess of 100,000 in population.
Right.
And so people don't understand that about the long distance trains. And I think as advocates, we cannot cannibalize each other. We have to support everybody's train that's important to them and understand why it's important to them.
Well, thank you, Todd. As a younger advocate, I find that super inspiring, and I'm glad we're on the same team.
Absolutely.
Let's go with Bruce next.
To me, the greatest challenge here in Texas is simply to get the general public to recognize what passenger rail service can mean to us. We are a pickup driving country. And it's just, we've raised 2 generations of people who have never been on a train. They have no way of conceiving what train travel can mean, how comfortable it is, how relaxing it is, how efficient it is. And that's our problem, The RPA people, the members, they recognize it, but we have not been able to get the general public to hear our message.
Okay. Steve?
Thank you. I basically agree with everything everybody has said. So I think the hardest challenge is going to be this multi-jurisdictional coordination to get this done. I mean, we're going to be asking for some rather large amounts of money to do a capital project someplace that's maybe outside of your state, and we got to do 5, 6, a dozen of those before we see the Sunset run daily. And keeping that coalition together is going to be a real challenge. You just have to look down to the Gulf Coast to see how fragile the coalition can be. One politician wants to make a point for their particular status, and they blow up the whole thing. So it's going to be a real challenge. And of course, there's no way that we know that UP might change the goalposts in 5 years. So I just see this effort as a real challenge.
It's all
But
good
the
to
only
take
path
into
forward,
Jim?
So every one of these answers has been fantastic, and I would agree with every one of them. And I guess the only thing I would add takes all of those answers and pushes them into the biggest problem that I see from my chair, which is that whether we're talking about the issues that George raised about politics, the issues that Todd raised about getting stuck in the past. All of these are legitimate, and all of these things I have found can combine to disengage advocates. Folks who've been at this for 30, 40 years, maybe longer, get discouraged, right? There's just like, you know, I've been doing this since whenever, and I'm still having the same fight, and it's just not working, and I'm ready to throw in the towel. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we have the younger advocates who are used to rapid success. They go on social media, they get a hashtag going, they get a lot of people to join in, and the local Starbucks 3 weeks later does what it is that they're wanting them to do. And that's not going to happen here. This is a long fight, and it's a tough fight. And we are making gains, and we are making a difference. And as George noted, we got the U.S. House of Representatives to change the mission of Amtrak. It's in the bill. Those are victories, but it's really hard when you look at the politics and you look at the state of play. It's easy to lose sight of that, and I see advocates get discouraged. And so I think my hardest challenge would be to keep everybody engaged and focused and fighting, because those little victories do add up to a big victory, even if it doesn't feel like a big victory at the time. So it's a little bit of an emotional obstacle that we have. But my message to everyone is to just don't give up, keep on fighting, because it really, truly works. And if you look at where we are now, particularly in the US Congress, compared with where we were even 2 years ago, it's head and shoulders better. We are making a difference. You are making a difference. So just take a deep breath and keep going forward.
Well, thanks for that little burst of optimism, Jim. And thank you to all of our panelists who joined us today. We have one more question. This is for Jim to just sort of close out our Q&A. I think this is a pertinent question that we should keep revisiting in future webinars as well. And it's a common question that I get from our members. I don't have a lot of time or money to commit right now, but I want to help. What can I do, Jim?
Oh my goodness. We can take 30 seconds of your time, and that will be enough in some cases. When we send out those emails looking for you to click on the voter voice campaign and generate an email to your congressman or your senator, that's huge. That does make a difference. When we ask for you to make a phone call to a congressional office, that's huge. That does make a difference. Those kinds of steps can take as little as 5 minutes. And that's sometimes all we really need, but we just need a lot of it. And so to the extent that we can get hundreds of people making that phone call, hundreds of people sending that email, that really can help our efforts, and has helped our efforts. The 3 times weekly campaign, we have seen thousands of responses to our voter voice initiatives, and the congressional offices are seeing that. So that alone can be very helpful. So I encourage you, don't put us in your spam filter. Please watch for those messages. When we send them out, we really do need you to click on that link. It only takes a couple minutes, and that alone can really help. And the other thing that you can do is, as we get into the fall, it is likely that we're going to reach a point where it's going to be about more than emails. Anyone who tries to call a congressional office right now, A, it's summer, B, we're in COVID. The likelihood of reaching a human is pretty low. But in the fall, we're going to have a very short period of time to try to get our message across, and we're going to need everybody to get on that phone and make that call. So this stuff does count. The staffers in these offices have little hash marks that they tally up what the sentiment is when people call in. So it really, truly does make a difference, even if it feels like it's a drop in the bucket to you. Honestly, it's not. So that's a big part of it.
Jim, could I build on your idea with just a little anecdote that proves that one call and one email is not enough? We were meeting with one of the House staffers, and he remarked that private cars seemed to be a big issue a month ago, but that we hadn't heard anything about it in the last week or so. So we guess that is no longer an issue. The important point is just an initial blast is not enough. It has to keep dripping in week after week after week after week so it stays top of mind. Otherwise, the urgency of the situation will decay.
That is 1000% correct, George. And that is why, I've actually heard from some members, they say, hey, you sent me that email 2 weeks ago. I clicked on it. I did it. Stop bugging me. Well, no, it's you got to bug them. We have to stay top of mind, as George notes. And George has a lot of experience in advocacy. And as far as I can see, George hasn't given up yet. So if George can be persistent, then so can you. So I really just encourage everyone to keep on making those appeals when we ask for them, because they really are important.
I think that's it for our Q&A session, guys. So we're going to move over to the IMPLAN economic modeling portion of the presentation. If we will mute cameras off and then give Jim just a moment to take over.
Okay, so I recognize everyone that we are a little bit over time. So I do apologize. However, we've gotten a lot of questions about the IMPLAN tool, our economic modeling, our economic studies. And this felt like a good time and place to take everyone through them and to understand what we're doing, how we do it, and why we're asking for what we're asking. Next slide, please, Joe. So as we've had this conversation all afternoon, we've always known that trains are economic engines in the communities they serve. The difference is that in 2018, we decided to go beyond traditional benefit cost analysis to make the economic case for communities large and small across the US. We wanted it to be more than anecdote. We wanted to be able to prove what we've been saying. Next slide. So let's start with the Gulf Coast Restoration Study. This was a study that was performed by the University of Southern Mississippi, the Trent Lott Center. And this was done to look at what would happen if you were to restore service in the Gulf Coast between New Orleans and Mobile. And that's as far as it went. Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, that was all it looked at. And it was a phenomenal study. And what they did was they found that even on the low end, Alabama would get $19 million benefit annually, Mississippi, $64.8 million, Louisiana, $86.7 million. And it was a different way of looking at it. It was the first time that someone had gone beyond the way that we typically see, for example, Amtrak or even the host railroads looking at these studies, which are very, very direct. It's, if I spend this much money building a railroad, how much fare will I get back? And it's very, very direct. But there's a lot more to it, as we know. When we saw the study and we supported the study and we supported distributing that study throughout the advocacy community and in Congress, we got together with Dr. Yvonne Zhang, who was a research professor at the Trent Lott Center. She specializes in transportation-related economic development. We looked at her model and we said, we'd like to take that model as Rail Passengers Association, refine that model so that it applies to a broader range of routes than just Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. We want to make this model into something that we could use to look at the entire system or any component of it. Next slide, please. And so what we have wound up with at Rail Passengers is a two-model process. We have an internal model that we developed, co-developed with Dr. Zhang and her postdoc students. And then we take that model and the outputs of that model and we add them to the IMPLAN tool. And I'll talk a little bit more about the IMPLAN tool in a second. Those together help you to look at the direct benefits, the indirect benefits, and the induced benefits as a whole. And that is how we help to make that case that trains deliver value to the served community of 6 or 7 or even 9 times the dollars that you invest in the service. The profit is that delta, that's what goes to the communities and the nation and not Amtrak. So we're really trying to show that these benefits accrue at a county by county level so that we can shift the conversation away from whether a route makes money and towards the idea of return on equity for the taxpayers living in those communities, in those counties, in those towns. Next slide, please. So this is a little bit of a picture on how it works. We, as a team here at Rail Passengers, worked with the University of Southern Mississippi to build another model. And we built that model using it was a comprehensive literature review of 40 plus papers. We use those to define the impacts to drive the benefits. And so that gives us the beginnings of an analysis. And it does a pretty good job of looking at all kinds of impacts that you might expect from additional travelers and passengers and trips diverted and so forth. But IMPLAN allows us to multiply the effects and look at the induced effects. So we can look at, for example, the example I love to use is you go into a community, you get off the train, you stay in a hotel or an Airbnb, you go to a restaurant, you go to a bar, and the money leaves your wallet and is left behind in the community. And because that happens, the people who live and work in that community benefit. The waiter or waitress at the restaurant benefits because you were there to eat and many other hundreds of people just like you come to eat. And that is something that you need to capture because it is an actual real benefit. IMPLAN lets you do that. It's a well accepted tool. It's a standard. It's used by universities, Fortune 500 companies, the Forest Service. It integrates a lot of Bureau of Labor Statistics data and local economic data, local economic taxes, tax rates, real estate, all of those things on a county by county basis. And that really helps us because you can't use the IMPLAN tool without the outputs of our proprietary model, but you also can't really calculate the multiplier effect from our model without the IMPLAN tool. So they really do go together. Joe, next slide. So our first study out of the gate using our new model was the Southwest Chief study. We inverted the question. What we've been trying to prove all along is look at the benefits that trains bring. In the case of the Southwest Chief, we needed to show what happens when you withdraw the train and withdraw the passengers and withdraw the service. And we were able to calculate that using these two models together, that would have caused $180 million in annual damage to the economies of the states served. And the beautiful thing here, again, is that we were able to do this study, but it's not a one-off. We have our own reproducible model that we can use to examine benefits. We can look at new visitor spending, induced travel, community development, pollution control savings, avoided vehicle miles traveled, you name it. All of those can be captured, quantified, put a dollar amount on them, and we can share that as a truer picture of what the trains are worth to each community. Next slide, please. We went on to use this to look on a smaller scale. We used it to look at the Empire Builder as a route. We used it to look at the proposed second train along that route between Chicago and Minneapolis-St. Paul. Same kind of analysis. We were able to look at the number of additional trips each year, what the value of those trips are worth to the communities served. Minnesota was wrestling with whether to move forward with its share of this project. And so we produced this research note for advocates in Minnesota to use. We were able to focus on Minnesota and show that Minnesota was going to get about $25 million in annual benefit from having this second frequency between Chicago and Minneapolis-St. Paul, and the state of Minnesota would probably pay something in the range of $3 million a year to accrue that benefit. So that's a tremendous payoff. You might even call that a profit. Next slide, please. I love this example of why IMPLAN is important. Our model captures the larger benefits at a sort of route level, a state level. But IMPLAN allows us to plug those in and calculate at a county by county level so that we truly can go into a community and say, as Bruce said earlier, this is what this means to you. This is, most of you, I hope you recognize this station. This is Cut Bank, Montana. And in 2018, 2,400 passengers alighted in Cut Bank. Now, the population of Cut Bank is 3,002. That year, that 2018, they created, those passengers getting off the train created $378,725 in value estimated for the community of Cut Bank. That is precisely because of the IMPLAN model that we were able to narrow it down to the community of Cut Bank and to be able to say to the folks in Cut Bank, this is what the train is worth to you. $378,000 a year comes to the town, this small town, as a result of the train. And oh, by the way, if you look at the amount of federal tax that every taxpayer in Cut Bank pays, their share every year of the Empire Builder is about $12,000. So once again, you can argue that the folks in Cut Bank are contributing $12,000 of their tax dollars to have an Empire Builder, and the community is getting back $378,000 in value. Next slide, please. So the thing I'd like to really leave with everybody is that we're not buying a study. A lot of these kinds of things in the past have been around, hey, we're going to commission a study, and we'll have a study, and you hand it out, and then the study instantly begins to age. In this case, we're buying a tool. We're buying a capability. We have the proprietary model. We can get about halfway across this slide here, the direct benefits and the indirect benefits. We're in the middle of an analysis right now on many routes to support some work that I'm going to be doing. I'm going to be testifying before the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee next month, and I'm hoping to share that information as part of my testimony. But when I take that output and put it into the IMPLAN model, now we can calculate the multiplier effects, get closer to really a fuller picture of the value of these trains to each community. And so we're looking at probably, depending on the route and depending on the particulars, adding the IMPLAN model probably adds anywhere from 50 to 75% of additional value calculated to the community. So the number for every community goes up by at least 50% or sometimes more by using the IMPLAN tool. We can show a wider range of benefits. We can capture more of the benefits created. And we think that if we can get the license plan in place, it's a 12-month term. Over those 12 months, with some help from volunteers and some focused effort, we think we can get another 6 to 8 full route analyses done. We already have a head start on some of them. Obviously, Southwest Chief we've already done. Empire Builder, we have a significant head start. The Sunset itself, we have a significant head start. I could actually get a Sunset Limited analysis completed within 30 to 45 days of turning the lights on this IMPLAN license, thanks to the legwork that's already been done. So we're very, very close on getting that work done. Next slide. So one way that you can help, as everyone has mentioned, the license for IMPLAN is $35,000. That is a 12-month license. Again, we're not buying a study, we're buying a tool that allows us to conduct as many studies as we can during the term of the license. And we already have our own proprietary model that gets us about halfway there in terms of the analysis, but adding IMPLAN helps us to multiply the value that we can report for each community. It makes that number bigger and more compelling. And so I'm going to leave this information here. We have set up an account for a Sunset Limited research effort. John Z. Stone, our resource director, is in charge of that. and her email is here on the slide. And we're going to make sure that we email directions to everybody on how to contribute, and we will give everybody ample opportunity to contribute to this effort if they can. Joe?
Thank you very much, Jim. So I'm going to leave with this. A question was asked in the chat very early in the presentation, asking, given Amtrak's plan to move all long-distance trains to tri-weekly service, how does this campaign for the Sunset Limited fit into the bigger picture? Well, you see on your screen right here, this is how it fits. We talked all day. You heard from George and Steve earlier about how 3 times week service costs more money for less. We can't let that happen across the entire network. Otherwise, you're going to see every route become the Cardinal or the Sunset, where we're trying to fight for daily service for those. So please, in that limited window we are going to have when the Senate comes back after recess, after Labor Day, please call the Capitol Switchboard, tell them to pass emergency funding for Amtrak, save daily service, save Amtrak jobs. You can find all the information at railpassengers.org/3x service. You will see all that we have done. You will find links to our action alert. You will find the Capitol Switchboard number. Please, by all means, join us making our voices heard and let them know that we need to keep daily service across the board, across the network, including bringing back daily service on these limited routes.
Exactly. I just want to emphasize what Joe has just said. We want everyone, when you make that call to the Congress, you want to ask for passing emergency funding for Amtrak trains, but you have to also ask for that funding to be contingent on protecting daily service and the workers. It's not free money. It's a rescue package that has conditions, and these are the conditions we want on that money.
Absolutely. So with that, I want to thank all of our speakers. I want to thank George and Steve, Todd, Bruce. I want to thank our staff, Jim and Maddie, for all of us putting this together. Please, and I want to thank all of you, our members, our advocates, our friends who have tuned in each month to this sort of new reality that we have with these online webinars. You make it possible. Thank you once again. I also want to point out what we're going to be taking place next month. We are going to be talking about new Amtrak corridors, expanding U.S. passenger markets. We will be welcoming Ray Lang, who is a Senior Director for National State Relations for Amtrak. That'll be taking place on September 23rd at 3 p.m. Eastern. So once again, thank you everybody for coming. Please, when you're out there travel, wear a mask, stay safe, be healthy. We'll see you soon.